If you joined us a few weeks ago, you might have seen a good friend of ours, Chad Kopenski, coming on and telling us about the fascinating history of Freemasonry in Ohio. Well, we had an amazing episode, really great conversation, so great that we didn't get to finish. So we have Chad back on this evening for part 2. So don't miss out, don't skip, you're going to want to hear it. We have an amazing episode lined up for you right after this on Historical Light.
Welcome back to the Historical Light Masonic Podcast, dedicated to illuminating our past and bringing our Masonic history to light since 2016. And now, enjoy the show.
Good evening and welcome back to Historical Light, an independent Masonic show focused on the historical events and aspects within Freemasonry. I'm your host, Brother Alex Powers. Pleased to be back for part 2 of this amazing episode. Brother Chad, thank you so much for joining us again this evening.
I appreciate you inviting me back. And the honor of being called a friend of the show, as my dog coughs in the background. I apologize. So
it's tradition at this point.
I think it is that, Trouble and Hazel come in and they just have to, announce their presence with authority.
There you go.
I want to say one nice thing before we start talking, just because I think
go for it.
One nice thing. So last week was the Midwest Conference of Masonic Education, and you were nice enough to have me on with that, and that's a whole other conversation we could have another time. But I think one of the fun things for me was as I was walking around the convention, about once every 20 minutes, somebody would stop me and say, I heard you on blank. And so you need to know that, at least last weekend in Canton, Ohio, I got stopped at least 3 or 4 times with somebody who said, hey, I heard you on Historical Light. And so you got fans as far whatever direction from you is Canton, Ohio. And it was kind of nice. It was so thank you for
fantastic to hear.
Thank you for the support. And it's always nice when people say nice things about your friends. That's all.
100%. Well, I don't want to cut you out on formalities. On the last episode, we went through with your introduction and everything. So I'm going to refer, if you missed out on that, be sure to check that episode out and hear that in totality. You're going to want to know that information. And Brother Chad went through his whole introduction there. We are good at talking. So I want to allow plenty of time to dive into the full story this evening and not take up too much extra within that. But before we get back to that, I do have a couple things to get through. For one, Yvette, my wife, is not with us this evening to share it out like usual. So I'm going to ask all of you watching this evening to do me a solid and share out this live so everyone else can see it on social media and join in with us as well. Other than that, we have 2 more things real quick. Got to give a huge shout out and thank you to our Patreon supporters who have helped keep our show around and keep us growing over the years since 2016. And if you like what you see here, like what we do for the history of Freemasonry, you too can jump on board by going over to historicallight.com/support and support the show through Patreon. And depending on the various levels you choose, you can get some pretty cool perks in there as well. Maybe I should have thrown up our Patreon deal instead of the about to start screen. I'm an amateur. I'm a hack. We're getting there. The other thing real quick is MasonicCon Kansas right around the corner. What's happening again? Historical Light is an official sponsor, and we hope you guys will join us. We have an amazing venue this year with Rosedale Lodge, also teamed up with Overland Park Lodge. We're going to be doing our meet and greet at Overland Park Lodge Friday evening, and then the full event will be at Rosedale Lodge on Saturday. We have an awesome lineup of speakers. I encourage you guys to jump over to MasonicConKansas.com, check out those speakers, and get your tickets while you still can. We're going to have to be turning off tickets for the festive board here pretty quick. So don't miss out. Secure your spot today. Man, Brother Chad, we had an amazing conversation last time I had you on the show. So good that we didn't get to finish our talk.
No,
and there's
really
still
didn't.
a lot to be said.
Well, Ohio's a fairly large state and has a fairly long history. And it seems to be one of those places, just because of where it's located, that it's sort of a crossroads, and it has been in our nation's history. And so just a lot of things end up kind of moving through there.
Sure.
And so, and you've heard me say all the time about, Masonry is about meaningful connections. And it just seemed to be, as you look into the history of Ohio Masonry, there are these connections to other places, other times, other areas. So it's all connected.
Fantastic. Well, I'm trying to remember where we left off last time, but I know
we went with the formation of Grand Lodge, which,
yes,
and I think, that only kind of scratched the surface. And one thing that I would say to anybody, really, whether you are an Ohio Mason or Kansas Mason or a Guamanian Mason, I'm sure there's Masonry on Guam, is that get into the proceedings of your Grand Lodge. And I know you think to yourself, that has to be the most boring stuff in the world. Honestly, it is truly fascinating, and it is a rabbit hole that I still have yet to, escape from. Because what you start seeing is you start seeing patterns. You get a lot of information. You start seeing how the people at that time dealt with many of the same issues that we deal with today, but
right.
also how they reacted to those issues at the time. We get one view of history, whatever is in, whoever wrote our textbooks in junior high and high school, it's one view. But to read what the discussion was when Prince Hall was established, and all of a sudden, Grand Lodges heard about this, or when all of a sudden there is this great westward expansion, to be able to sort of understand what the people at that time were thinking, right or wrong, and I think we've said in the past that, viewing it with that context in mind, that at that time, at that place, that's what they believed. It's not necessarily what we believe in or think now, but it's still fascinating because ultimately Freemasonry isn't the story of buildings and movements. It's the story of people. And when you start looking at those
100%.
proceedings, what you get the sense of are, you get a sense of what the people are and what the people are doing.
Well, and it's fascinating because, and this is where we encourage everyone to jump into the history of your lodge, of your jurisdiction, because it is a story of people, 100%. It's really beautiful how, as Freemasonry expands, our country's expanding. Like, that it's the drive of people that's making this happen. But those very guys that we see influential in Freemasonry in all of these various areas are also some of the biggest names that you'll find that established stuff in our areas that really flourish our locations today.
Well, and the one thing that I wish people would do is, and this, is, I think we've said this before, I love the stories of the guys who aren't in the Grand Lodge proceedings. I love the stories of the guys who are in the minutes. I love, looking at, and I love the stories of Masons they don't build statues about,
right.
that, because those are the guys who made Masonry what it is. One brother at a time, one handshake at a time, one community, one lodge at a time.
Yeah.
And they don't build statues to those guys. But
it's so
those
true.
stories shouldn't be forgotten.
So, like, you go into any lodge today, and one of the most dominant things you're going to find in that lodge typically is a past master's wall. This, full wall of photographs of every guy that served in the East there. And that's usually the iconic image of that lodge's history, is just that wall. But think about how many guys never appeared on that wall, but how much work they did to make that lodge what it was, to make that community what it was. Some of the guys I've been able to write the biggest presentations about, you can barely find a picture of.
Oh, yeah. But even not even stranger, but just, I don't know if I told the story on this podcast or not, but a zillion years ago, I was doing I didn't say like 5 years ago, I was doing the officer installation in my home lodge. And one thing I like to do is I like to call out who the oldest past master is, not in terms of like age, but in terms of who served, the longest to go. And it just so happened that at that particular moment, as I'm doing the installation, I realized I was the oldest past master in the lodge, right? That there was nobody in the lodge there right now who was sitting in a chair when I was going through the degrees for one reason or another.
Wow. Right.
And yesterday was my 13th anniversary of being raised, right? So in 13 years, and this actually not bad, in 7 years, the guys who were there when I was raised weren't in lodge. So that past master's role is amazing. But as I keep telling brethren, you got to keep those stories alive. You got to keep that family history, that oral history alive, because otherwise that's just a bunch of names on a wall. But if you keep
100%.
those stories alive, keep talking about them, it's our family history. So
For sure.
we've really gotten off topic. We've only been talking for like 10 minutes.
So I know what you wanted to dive in this evening. We had talked a little bit in the green room and prior, being about ritual and kind of how that got established within your jurisdiction.
Well, and Ohio is an odd crossroads. And it's one of those places that touches up against some other jurisdictions that are major players. And I kind of, lovingly call them the ritual wars, even though there wasn't really, shots fired.
Sure.
And it really was, it's hard to call it a war as much as it is just an attempt for jurisdictions to kind of establish their own identity.
Sure.
So Grand Lodge of Ohio started in 1808, right? And when that started, lodges just worked in the rituals from the tradition that sired them. So if they came from Massachusetts or New York or Grand Lodge of England, and so what you had is, for years, you had lodges that just kind of did their own thing as they heard it or understood it, and so you could very easily get to the point where you might have maybe two lodges share the same building or two lodges in the same town that work in two completely different rituals.
Right.
I mean, you couldn't necessarily go from one lodge to the next and be able to, to fit in. What I also think is interesting and is that there was no real requirement for proficiency when a Grand Lodge started. It took 42 years. I'm bad at math. It took 34 years for them to actually require that candidates are examined in open lodge in the degree that they have been taken. So they have to possess some degree of knowledge as a condition of advancement. But at this point, we didn't have that written proficiency that many of us, well, I can't even say that because nowadays it's changed from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. In Ohio, our proficiencies we have many of them, but our main one is the question and answer, right? Whence came you? From the Lodge of Holy Saints John. What came you here to do? Pack my bags and go to Muncie. I mean, whatever the answers, the answers are.
Muncie, the secret word.
Muncie, the secret word. It's not a bad town, by the way. So there was this struggle within Ohio to actually, at some point you have to establish your identity, right? That's what our ritual, a lot of what it is saying, okay, we are Ohio Masons, or we are Kansas Masons, or Wisconsin Masons. And part of what defines us are our traditions. And part of our tradition is our ritual. So that, in theory, you can go to any lodge anywhere and you can be a part of that family. That's, as you talk about cultures, that's a big thing, is that common language, common tradition, common whatever. Ohio had the hardest time in the world trying to get that thing right. We tried so hard to get to a standardized ritual, and we were inspired by the Baltimore Convention back in 1843. And many brethren probably know about this, but in 1843, there was a convention in Baltimore of pretty much it called for representatives from all the major Grand Lodge jurisdictions at the time. And the goal was to try to establish a common work within the United States. Part of that convention was a discussion about possibly establishing a Grand Lodge of the United States, but that was pretty much, almost always doomed to fail. But even then, just kind of saying, okay, we have all these people, and all these traditions. Can we at least say here in America, we're at least going to base off of this. And Ohio they bit pretty hard on what came out of that convention. They were very much like, yeah, what happened there in Baltimore, that's great. They actually empowered the particular delegate there who is proficient in that work to start traveling around the state and teaching people that particular work. He failed miserably because lodges didn't want to, provincial masonry being what it is, people were like, no, that's different from what I learned. I don't want to do that. I want to keep doing what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's the struggle to get a unified ritual in Ohio took generations. The other thing that came about, which was difficult, was that right around, again, after that 1843 convention, a couple of things start happening. We actually get a resolution that allows work to be done in all 3 degrees, which still doesn't happen in some jurisdictions, but can in Ohio. In about 1849, they start requiring that they require that all lodges update their bylaws so that there is actually a requirement for proficiency to go forward in degrees. What the proficiency is not spelled out. Just that somebody has to be examined in lodge and deemed proficient by the master, whatever that means.
Right.
What we also saw at that time, starting at about 1840, was there were a lot of people who were traveling around saying that work that was done in Baltimore, that was not the correct work, that they were in fact in possession of the true, correct, and ancient work, and that they would teach this lodge that true, ancient, and correct work for a price. So there are a lot of, for lack of a better word, traveling salesmen who are going around saying, what you're doing now, that's just total bunk right here. I got the winning stuff right here, and I'll teach it to you for meh. And these people made a boatload of money. And whether or not they had the true work, I mean,
right,
that's hard to say. But it was enough of an issue. I mean, that in 1850, that Ohio passed a law basically saying it prohibited any unauthorized persons giving instruction in ritual work for pay. And that caused a slight riot because, now people are arguing over what is actually, what is right? What is the right work? So did this happen in your jurisdiction too? Like, is this somewhat similar or no?
It is somewhat similar. So Kansas had a really weird story. And like you said, typically jurisdictions would take their ritual from where they came from. Kansas Masonry came out of Missouri Masonry. As the Indian Territory became a thing, guys came over and Masonry was established, or so we thought. It might have already been here.
Right.
The Wyandotte Indians came down from Ohio. And what we've learned recently through research is when they came from Ohio, they brought their own functioning Masonic lodge. So they were already practicing Freemasonry here. Now, I remember I've checked with you and we could never find records that they were actually made Masons in Ohio. But what we have found is that French soldiers had initiated a bunch within the Wyandotte tribe. So we assume that those Indians that came down here were initiated into Masonry by the French. Tribal leaders at that time didn't really look into government and grand lodges as, jurisdictional necessaries. They saw themselves as running their own stuff. So they probably didn't feel that they needed a grand lodge. But shortly after coming to Kansas, they were getting a lot of push from guys on the Missouri side to establish something sanctioned. But even within that, we see for years prior to the Grand Lodge of Kansas becoming a thing, we have guys from all over traveling in, even from the Masonic College, coming in and having Masonic discourse, whatever that means, with these Wyandotte officials. So they had to have been recognized and considered regular to some degree. But within that, when Kansas Masonry started, they didn't actually take the ritual from Missouri as you would think. And that's the common joke here in Kansas is our Missouri guys will say when the guys from Kansas went over there, they dropped all the good stuff in the river on the way over, and they've got this watered down ritual. But for like 20, 30 years in Kansas, there was no set ritual. So many guys were coming through here as the territory was opened up and that westward expansion was taking place. We had so many people coming from so many different locations. It was said to be really a time of chaos in Masonry here, because not just from one lodge to another, but from one lodge meeting to another lodge meeting, the exact same lodge.
Depending on who the master is and what they knew, yeah.
Right. You'd experience entirely different rituals. So somebody may get a first degree in this type of ritual, second degree in this type of ritual. It's all over the place. So same type of deal. Around the Baltimore convention, they had sent up several guys, Vanderslice being one guy I have a big presentation on, and they brought back that to be the official work. And same type of thing. They opened up official-based classes all over the state to teach that work and sanction. So that was the only work allowed in Kansas after that point.
Did it actually catch on, or did you guys kind of like poo-poo it as well?
No, it caught on, and I mean, out of force, right? Obviously
Gotcha.
It, probably lacks in many areas today, but that standardized work is fairly close still today of exactly what we use. Not much within that work has changed from the point it was adopted.
And ours sort of has changed. I mean, after that convention, after that prohibition, which is 1850 of saying like, you can't have the hucksters come in and teach stuff. 1857, they actually grabbed all of the the quote unquote district lecturers and they put them in a room and like, okay, let's actually figure this darn thing out.
Right.
They did it like mouth to ear in the room. And then they sent out these district lecturers to go promulgate it like mouth to ear. And it ended up, another weird way to look at Ohio is how they've redistricted themselves over the years and how that districting has affected things like the selection of grandmasters, the promulgation of ritual that not today, because that involves math and charts.
That becomes a story of its own, I'm sure.
There's always a story. But that ritual they did in 1857, nobody likes it then either. Like they just
of course,
nobody wants it. And
that's
so
not the way we did it.
That's not the way we did it. And we're pretty close to Kentucky, at least down, by Cincinnati. And we got my buddy Rob Morris, and Rob starts doing his wackiness, and Rob Morris, if people listening to the podcast don't know, I mean, he was a past Grandmaster of Kentucky. He, I think wrote the ritual for Order of the Eastern Star. He is considered something, depending on who you talk to, he is at least a colorful and interesting character in Masonry.
Yeah.
And, some will say that because of him, he's the reason why Kentucky has no standardized ritual. They've got like 3 of them. But
well done.
My buddy Rob is close enough to Cincinnati where there's all these Masonic publishers, right? We got Shearer and Lilly and like all the rest of the people who were there. Morris picks my buddy John Shearer. And like 1857, 1858, Rob Morris starts his shenanigans, for lack of a better word. He says that he actually has the most pure version of, the Preston or the Webb ritual at that point. And he starts telling people, again, you pay me and I will gladly give you or teach you this ritual. And he has entire books written, right? He gets John Shearer to write Gems of Masonry. He gets him to do a Freemason monitor. John Shearer is this beautiful engraver, that I'm obsessed with. And honestly, if you are, I think I've said this before on this podcast, go to the Library of Congress, look up John Shearer and get Gems of Masonry, which is an early explanation of the symbols, or the Freemasons monitor, again by Shearer, which is pretty much that Webb monitor with explanation by Morris of the symbols with great graphics by Shearer. Like it's free from the Library of Congress. It's a really great view of early Masonry, but this is also Morris's and Shearer's way of trying to like make a buck and put their ritual out to everybody. Ohio takes a look at that and says, well, okay, that sounds good. But we have to Ohioize it. So we do their own version of the ritual in 1859. And they actually put out a huge edict saying, okay, just kind of like Kansas said, by whomever, you cannot do any ritual other than this 1859 ritual that we've written.
Right.
Actually, it's not even written at this point. It's still mouth to ear. Like, so we're going to send out district lecturers to teach it to you, and if you do one thing out of step, I don't know if the Grand Lodge SWAT team's going to come get you. And it's crazy to me that we didn't write any of this stuff down, right? I still think to this day that probably the most influential piece of work ever in American ritual has to be like Duncan's, Masonic ritual in cipher. When was that? 1860. Once that came out, that's when guys actually bought it. And like, what am I supposed to be saying here? They probably had more influence on what ritual is nationwide than any other convention. And you still find versions of that.
So on that train of thought, I'm curious.
Sure.
Have you guys discovered, or maybe still have, early illegal ciphers been discovered for Ohio work?
You mean the ones that may or may not be about 3 feet in front of me on this desk? No, I don't know anything about them. No clue. I don't know what you're talking about. Like the ones that use symbols as opposed to letters? No, I don't know. No.
Well, so we've obviously, discovered a lot of illegal ciphers back in the day for various rites and orders and stuff, usually from Reading Co. out in New York. But here in Kansas, we actually still have physical copies of some of the earliest ciphers, and I believe one or two of them predate that web work that was adopted. And they weren't known to exist until the guys handed them over on their deathbed saying, we don't want anyone else to find this. The first one that was shared was single letter, and it took me a good week to crack it.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really cool because it was not only single letter, and I'd have to look at it and re-crack it essentially, but it's like it was written backwards, almost like a Judaic text. And then it wasn't in order either. It skipped around, but there was a method to it that finally, when you figured that out, it's like, oh, holy crap, I can read this now. But it was very, very clever.
Wisconsin ritual from 1918. I have an Illinois one in here from ridiculously early. But I mean, we had in our code for the longest time that you couldn't be in possession of any ritual other than, this one. This in Ohio, brethren could actually buy their own personal printing of, our ciphered ritual for the first time in 2005. Up until that time,
wow.
Up until that time, a lodge would be given a certain number of rituals. And so if you were an officer, then you might have one. If you were a candidate going through the degrees, there might be a divided ritual that you may have, or just the proficiency portion of it. But it could very easily be the case that, the only time you ever saw a ritual or had a ritual to study from was when you got the degrees and were doing your proficiency. You might never see it again if you were never an officer.
That's interesting. I'd venture to say Kansas has probably had printed rituals since at least the 80s, maybe slight prior.
We've had them. Brethren just couldn't buy their own copy of them. They were limited to the lodge.
To the lodge. I got you.
Yeah. So
interesting.
Yeah. So in 1893, we're going to wait for myself. 1891, there's a group that gets together and tries to start writing like a true, like pen and ink copy of the ritual that's going to be kept in the care of Grand Lodge. And I have seen that book, and it's hysterical because there's spelling errors all over the place, and there's like pencil marks as to how wrong it is. 1893, they actually print out ciphered rituals that are given to Grand Lodge officers and the district lecturers. So they actually have a standardized. And then they said, okay, 1895, they actually give a copy of that ciphered ritual to every lodge. So every lodge at that point, and there were 400 and some, right, in 1895, has their own copy of cipher ritual. The monitorial parts, those are, you could buy that almost anywhere. I mean,
Right.
But then when it was about 1921 was one of the last big revisions. And that's when they have a revision that is ciphered more like we know now, has the rubrics for how people are supposed to move. But at that point, 5 were sent to every constituent lodge. So that would be for the 3 main officers, secretary, and they had five of them. I forget who they're supposed to go to, but that was it. And so every lodge had their own 5. Now
Right.
that typewritten ritual, there was one copy, and district deputies, and when we still had district lecturers, they could actually check that out every once in a while and have a typewritten ritual meeting. And I don't have the exact date, but it's been in the last 30 or so years that there's now a typewritten ritual in every district in Ohio. So every one of our 25 districts has an actual typewritten ritual that, a lodge can actually go and check out. And if they need to, they can actually see written out
Interesting.
what word that is actually supposed to be. And actually, it is the expectation of our district education officers and our district deputies that they'll hold a typewritten ritual meeting in each of the degrees every year. So
Wow,
other
okay.
jurisdictions will have schools of instruction. It's kind of how we do that, in that it is the expectation that the district leadership will hold a typewritten ritual. So you can come there and say okay, what is this word supposed to be? Or
Right.
what is it actually supposed to do?
So here in Kansas, obviously, brothers can get their own rituals, printed off. Those early ones, I don't know. You have a good point. I'm gonna have to check in on that, if they were lodge specific or if they were distributed. I'm not 100% sure, but I've heard rumors. I can't say for sure because I've never seen it myself. I've heard rumors that Kansas also has a fully written out ritual from when they first adopted it. From that very first, when web work came back, that it was written out 100% into this book that's been in the Grand Lodge vault. I've heard stories from this from credible sources, and one past Grandmaster told me to go tell Most Worshipful Tracy Bloom, our Grand Secretary, hey, let Alex see that sometime. And I was up there once and I mentioned it to him and he just smiled at me and didn't say anything. So I'm like,
Yep.
I'm not finding out, am I? So I've heard rumors, but I've never seen it myself to actually say it exists. But kind of I think Virginia is the same case. They're still mouth to ear, but there's rumors that something like that exists, but can't be confirmed.
I wonder if it's because they felt like they were breaking their vow or breaking their,
Probably.
So
Doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, right? Kind of during anti-Masonry, when everyone was publishing up those monitors, who was it bought mostly by? Masons. It's just that they had something that they could actually learn from, and work from. And there are some that will say that was actually the worst thing that we ever did to our ritual, was actually write it down or go away from mouth to ear. And I think we talked about this. I mean, the whole point of proficiency is that it's you sitting down with another brother and they're talking to you, interacting with you.
Oh yeah. I mean, especially on the aspect of mentorship and that bond.
Right.
I think we see so much today, at least I've seen, the downfall of mentorship has so much become just checking in of, hey, you got that memorized yet? All right, I'll call you next week.
Well, and as we talked about in the past, how do you define what a good Mason is? And then somebody will say that the definition of a good Mason is somebody who's a good ritualist and can memorize things well. And that's the thing this is where I get in trouble sometimes, is that nowhere in Ohio code does it say that anything has to be memorized. Nowhere. And so when guys come to me and say, our ritual has to be memorized, I'm like, oh yeah, the tradition says that. Absolutely. Doesn't say that anywhere in our code. that proficiencies have to be done from memory. You gotta, I'm with you, totally with you, absolutely. But if you want to go to the letter of the law, no, it doesn't. So, and again, I have to wonder, Grand Lodge of Ohio existed for what, 30 some years before they required any kind of proficiency. And then really almost 80 some years before they actually had a standardized ritual. Some people are saying, well, we've always had proficiencies. It's always been memorized. I'm like, I don't know about that, guys, so, but like I said, I mean, the establishment of that ritual really has a lot to do with our identity. And I think all of us who have gone and seen ritual from another jurisdiction, we end up getting amazed at what is similar and what is different.
Right.
I mean, we have a chat that we have offline with our friends. I remember once we sat there talking about how the names of the fellowcraft in the third degree were different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And none of us had ever thought about that. And we made a chart and we're like, well, how does this work? Right? Ohio uses this, and that makes no sense. And right, Kansas does this, and Virginia does this. And I think Wisconsin, if I remember right, doesn't even say the names. They just kind of go out and yell something and come back and say, yep. So it's, and that to me is kind of one of the fun things, is seeing the differences in ritual. Because again, it's our own identity. It's our own, sort of thing. But one thing that I want to make sure we talk about, just because I think it is intriguing, and I see that I've already wasted, almost 40 minutes of time. So I apologize about that.
Not a waste.
Is the Cerno rite in Ohio? Because this, to me, I think is one of the most fascinating things in our history that I think is, if anybody's interested in Masonic history, it's worth looking into. There's so many great primary source documents from many different jurisdictions to get their viewpoints on it, and understanding that this issue ripples through different jurisdictions for all across the country, and ended up, I think, in my opinion, sort of establishing some fairly fundamental tenets in Masonry, really across jurisdictions. So this is a period of time of about 10 years, 10, 15 years in the late 1800s. So we're looking at about like 1886 or so onward, that there was a group that was trying to compete with what we know as the established, ancient, and accepted Scottish rite. And they were known as the Cerno rite. A different set of degrees. I think they came out of New York, and, but they started to take hold here in Ohio. And there was a competition in terms of which one of these appendant bodies was going to be allowed in Grand Lodge of Ohio established lodges, like what was going to be allowed to be there. And at this point, the Grand Lodge of Ohio, they were allowing what we would call the York Rite bodies. They that had been established, that had been a connection that they were okay with. They weren't okay with anybody else. They were still a little nervous about Scottish Rite in terms of, like, they knew it was out there, and some of the Grand Masters had taken some of those degrees, but still they're like, that's sort of us. But honestly, as Grand Lodge of Ohio, we really only have jurisdiction over Blue Lodge craft masonry.
Sure.
They didn't allow Eastern Star to meet in buildings. They said they were clandestine, and because Rob Morris and whatever. But when Grand Lodge said, we're not sure whether we have jurisdiction over something that isn't craft masonry, where there's a vacuum, things get filled, and so you have these competing forces, what we call ancient accepted Scottish Rite and the Cerno Rite. And finally, Grand Lodge of Ohio actually says, okay, 1887, unanimously, they declare that the Cerno Rite is irregular, clandestine, and that anyone who takes, receives, communicates, is present at, assists in any way, shape, or form with any of the Cerno Rite degrees, that is unmasonic conduct, and we'll give you a trial, but then you're going to be expelled. Like, it's not even maybe baby. It's just, you want to do Cerno, you can go. That's it. 1891. So, 4 years after this is declared clandestine, New England Lodge number 4, one of the original lodges that came together to start Grand Lodge of Ohio, basically tells Grand Lodge of Ohio to, go do something anatomically impossible, and says, you don't really have the right to tell us which Scottish rite we can accept. You don't have that authority. And so you declaring Cerno Rite as clandestine, that actually goes against our ancient landmarks and goes against our beliefs as Masons. And so we're declaring you, Grand Lodge of Ohio, as clandestine. And
snap.
us and 27 other lodges, we're going to go create our own Grand Lodge of the ancient free and accepted Masons of the state of Ohio. And this is kind of a big deal. Sure. Because now you've got 27 lodges, including some of the major players, splitting over this. And this causes a huge rift in Ohio. And you start seeing discussions happening in Georgia, in New York, obviously. One of the more interesting things is that there ends up being this huge tiff between the state of Washington and Ohio that happens through the fraternal consultants, because state of Washington basically says, we see what's happening here in Ohio, and this is just wacky, and gives their rationale. And the fraternal consultant for Ohio thoroughly misread it, misunderstood what was said, and basically then writes a really nasty letter back to Washington, threatening that they're going to withdraw recognition because of what Washington said about Cerno. And Washington writes back and says, it's like, I feel bad that I'm insulting both the Grand Lodge of Washington and the Grand Lodge of Ohio by saying it's like schoolgirls, arguing over lunch. But that's,
I think we've all experienced Masonry in that light.
I'm sorry about that. It's not the way it's supposed to be.
But the politics of our unpolitical society, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's don't get me started on that stuff. Like, I have a daughter she's getting towards the end of her 8th grade year. I'm in the I don't know about that stuff. So, but it starts to be a big issue, because now, again, who has the right to establish what is acceptable in Masonry within, a state? Is there, is Scottish Rite its own thing? Is Blue Lodge its own thing? Is York Rite? Like, who has that authority? And so there were 3 cases that were brought in Ohio, legal cases, because brethren who adhered to Cerno Rite went to go to, their home lodge. Ohio at this point was actually requiring a loyalty oath. So if you went to go visit a lodge, you had to declare upon your honor that you did not now or had ever, held allegiance to the Cerno Rite or any other rite declared, illegal or clandestine by the Grand Lodge of Ohio. And so guys were like, I don't know that I can't on my honor take that pledge. And so if guys wouldn't take that pledge, then they weren't allowed to be installed as officers. They weren't allowed to visit. They weren't allowed to do all these things. And so they actually sued the Grand Lodge of Ohio, these 3 guys, 3 different cases. And it got brought all the way up to the Ohio Supreme Court, who took all these cases and were like, okay, this is weird. But it was big enough, and there was enough support behind it, that these people were basically saying that they're being treated unfairly by the Grand Lodge of Ohio, and they were seeking relief from the civil courts. And the Supreme Court basically decided it went to the Circuit Court, which said one thing, that's the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically said that the civil courts have no standing when it comes to this fraternal order. That I'm going to read this because I think it says it right there. So
Yeah.
We must presume that the trial of the plaintiffs will be in accordance with natural right and the rules of the order. That if these guys, they have Masonic trial and are expelled, like we have to presume that that's good. That they will not be expelled for disregarding any requirement which the Grand Lodge has no authority to make. Should the trial result otherwise, it will be the duty of the plaintiffs to resort to such modes of redress as may be had in the jurisdicatories of the order. In essence, that it's now a part of settled law that a Masonic lodge has the right to try and discipline its members in accordance with the laws of the order, and that the remedy or any claim of error to such trial is to the higher tribunals of the order itself, that the civil courts will not interfere with the construction or enforcement of Masonic law. That's a big deal, believe it or not. I mean, I know it sounds kind of silly, but for the civil courts to say, guys, that's you all, right, not us. And we can see both the good and the bad in that going forward, right? When there's affirmative action, basically this case law holds up saying the federal government has no real jurisdiction over what happens in that, select order or that private order.
Right.
When, if somebody does get expelled and they believe that it's unfair, they can't run to their legislator. They can't run to the local court. It has to be done within the order. That wall, that judicial wall saying that, there's Masonry and there's the society and the civic court. That's pretty big. That's pretty huge, I think.
And I think that used to be looked at so much deeper as well, because I think at least here, Masonic trials today kind of they definitely go on, but it kind of seems to be behind the curtains and not really talked about. And if you look back into Kansas history, we had some pretty big Masonic trials when guys were brought up on charges, and it was full things. I mean, they would take over the county courthouse and they'd bring in actual attorneys, and it was big things and documented in the papers. And you don't quite see that level of it today, but these guys took those accusations very seriously and fought them. And I mean, yeah, when you see at that level that the actual law can't step in, you see it duplicated in an interesting manner.
Well, and unless the law gets broken, right?
Correct.
I mean, yes. then when the state has standing, then they can actually step in. But otherwise, and again, this is where I can get in trouble. But I mean, we have all heard of trials, where there is the presumption that there is due process and that it is a fair process. But the truth is, you're dealing with Masonic law and a Masonic court, not a civic law and a civic court. They operate differently. And I think we need to understand that. I mean, for good or for bad, like there is that wall and there is that separation. But I had a point I was going to make and it just left my head. I think if I get a drink of water, it might come back. But
well, on that topic, just to throw it out there, and I'm not going to go into detail because probably not allowed to, and any of you guys should catch on, and otherwise hit me up and we can chat in private. But Masonic trials have often been curious to me because of certain obligations we take within that of protection of another brother, that we're able to get to the point of a Masonic trial. It seems like tricky grounds because of various obligations, but I don't know. I mean, there's also that weighing factor, but it's hard to navigate because of specific wordings used.
Well, and the hard part is that dude, you're gonna open up a huge can of worms here, and because neither one of us is going to want to or should speak about specifics. I mean, that's
Right.
just the truth. But I mean, if there are people who've done something patently wrong, right?
Mhm.
They, as a Mason, but then they go and I don't know, uh, pick some felony, then according to our bylaws, like that's pretty cut and dry. But then it's the other stuff where it just gets, it gets weird, it's um, and when you look, and it's funny because when you look through our proceedings, probably the first 100 years of our proceedings, lodges are trying to prefer charges against guys for things like swearing, drinking,
Yeah.
being lazy, not obeying the Sabbath, and so I mean, and you see in the Grand Master's elocutions all these decisions they have to make where they're just like, really, you're going to make me like, you know. I saw one once, and this is still to me one of the funniest things in the world. And I wish I could remember what year it was, because one of those things I like saw in passing, and I'm like, that's funny. I got to come back to that, and totally didn't write it down. A lodge wrote a letter to Grand Lodge seeking permission to put a clock in their lodge room because they thought, based off of some, I'm going to tell the story wrong. They felt that somehow they had run afoul of Masonic law because they wanted to put a clock in their lodge room. And I got to go find it because
I'd be interested to hear that story for sure. You're bringing up odd cases, and of course the profanity issue, and it sparks my mind. When I was digging through Gardner's history, I came across thick manila envelope, probably 1920s, Gardner, Kansas, middle of nowhere at the time.
not Dan Gardner,
Right.
So it wouldn't surprise me if he had big, huge, yeah. So,
but it was a lodge trial here in Gardner, and guy deserved to be on trial 100%. But what really was comical to me, so the whole story was, it was a member of the lodge, and apparently this happened in the intersection just below the lodge. And I don't know if lodges just got out, but there's a lot of brothers there. Of course, it's a small town. That little main strip is like all there is, so everyone's probably hanging out there. But there was a little bit of an altercation in the intersection, and two guys started yelling at each other. The one guy that was the more hothead was a Mason from Gardner Lodge, and ended up getting some kind of a gun and threatening the person. And all this is documented, and it's right middle of the day in front of the whole town. But the majority of everything that was disputed in this Masonic trial, they're really focusing on the fact that he was using language unbecoming of a Mason in front of a lady. Like that, it was like the whole fighting, the pulling a gun on somebody, pointing it at him. That happened, but he used bad words.
That's just.
It amuses me.
We talked about, like, for easily 75 years in our history, it was parsing alcohol, who could sell it,
Yeah.
your relationship and how many steps away you were from the production, sale, distribution of alcohol, and if you were allowed to be a Mason or not. Right. It was. And then they're arguing over things like, okay, if it's 2% versus 3.5, like and you see generations of arguments over this. And at some point, again, this is sort of, I'm working on a presentation for a table lodge I'm going to be doing in June. And part of it is sort of, looking at some of these things in our history. And you kind of want to wonder to yourself, like, at what point did we say to ourselves as a lodge, like really, like, that's what we're going to argue about? We're going to argue about this. Like, is this what Masonry is going to be? Like, do you really have to, like, I don't know. You also said, can you just be like, why is this what we're arguing about? Why are we arguing over the length of tails, or whether the points in or out, or apron like over the coat or under the coat. Why are we arguing over that?
Right.
When, but then I'm kind of like arguing against myself, because the truth is, what did I say at the beginning? This establishment of a standardized ritual, when in Ohio, helped establish us as, it gave us identity, it gave us a common tradition, a common purpose, common everything, helped establish us as the Grand Lodge of Ohio. So therefore, I guess those same rules and mores and interpretations, right? If you're going to be a part of this family, these are our rules. So, I mean, it kind of goes both ways. It just, again, you always wonder about like why we're arguing about that when there's other things we could be arguing about. Anyway,
most definitely.
So I got to none of the other thing I want to talk about was the history of education in Ohio, and then we got to none of that, by the way.
Sounds like we're going to do an episode 3.
Dear sweet, yeah, probably. But the big thing I think I want people to take away from the idea of ritual, at least this part of Ohio history, is that Ohio really has been kind of a crossroads. And that when you start looking at the proceedings and start looking at what guys are talking about, I would urge everybody to look at there's usually a section in the back of all the proceedings that it's the fraternal consultant or the fraternal correspondent. It's the guy who's read all the proceedings from all their other jurisdictions and is commenting on what's happening. And that to me is also incredibly interesting.
Masonic Cliff Notes.
Well, it's interesting to see the connections. It's also interesting to see, different jurisdictions wrestle with the same things, and they take their cues from each other. And I mean, like Prince Hall, alcohol, Cerno Rite, the different independent bodies, establishment of ritual. Ohio for the longest time, and up to like the 60s, I think, you could only petition a lodge that each lodge had a boundary around it. And if you lived within that boundary, you had to petition that lodge first. And even if you wanted to go to the other lodge, you had to petition that lodge who like owned you first. And if not, then, and
it was the same here as well.
For a good 120 years in our history, so many of the arguments are some lodge saying, hey, they talked to John first and he belongs to us. So,
right. It's a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. But
the jurisdictional part of it?
Well, just linking somebody because of where they live to that one particular lodge. I get the stance that lodges should be the same, but I think there's also a huge factor that you have a personality in each lodge. And
I agree.
One guy might not fit in as well in this lodge as this lodge, and there might be better harmony if he goes over here than here.
Now, I agree with you wholeheartedly, absolutely. But I'm going to give you the counter argument.
Sure.
And it's going to be a very weird, not tangential. For a period of time, I was a teacher in the Milwaukee Public Schools in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Okay.
And Milwaukee, Wisconsin determined that teachers were necessary employees like firefighters, paramedics, doctors. And so as a condition of your employment, you had to live within the city of Milwaukee. Never mind the fact that on a teacher's salary, you couldn't actually afford a house in the city of Milwaukee. Doesn't matter. And for the longest time, I kind of bristled against that because I was young and, can't tell me what to do. But the reason why they did that was because, one, in the case of emergency, teachers need to get to school, because if teachers get to school, it's and secondly, that tax base and that support. You knew that guys are traveling someplace to go to work. The fact that they lived in the communities in which they served or worked, they had an investment in those communities. So
that's a good point. Yeah.
If you live here in Albany, Ohio, then maybe the lodge that's in Albany, Ohio, because then those are those meaningful connections in your town. Those are your neighbors. Those are the teachers. Like, that's an investment in the town that you're in, even if Albany's not a crappy lodge, but even if I'm saying it's a crappy lodge, but
now you're opening a can of worms.
Oh, I love the guys in Albany; they're wonderful. Bob Socha, all those guys, they're great. Love them. But Slat, one of their officers there is one of my top line signers. Anyway, but that's a whole other thing about the idea of if brethren are allowed to, what lodge they're allowed to petition.
Sure.
Yeah, we got to none of the other stuff I wanted to get to today. I'm terribly sorry, but
as always, it was a fantastic conversation.
But I think the last thing I'm going to say before I let you talk is to say, it's really easy for us to kind of write off the history of our lodges or to think about, get in there. I mean, I would urge every Ohio Mason, any Mason, go to, George Washington Memorial, where those archives are, look up your lodge, like when it was chartered. There's usually probably, just find out those names. We talked about that wall of past masters.
Yeah.
It's some of those lodges actually have those lists of past masters going back hundreds of years. There's stories about those guys. Keep those stories alive. Can I tell one last interesting story and then I'm done? I swear to go to the toast.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if did I tell the story about one of the Grand Masters from my lodge? I don't know if I ever have it.
I don't know.
Guy's name is Joseph McHenry Goodspeed. It's the only Grand Master to come from my home lodge. His claim to fame is that he actually set the jurisdictional number required to open lodge and transact business in Ohio, which is different than our number in our ritual. It's a constitutional number. But what to me is the funny story about Goodspeed is that after he was Grand Master and he was working here locally, his wife died mysteriously and suddenly and tragically. And he was charged. He was under suspicion for the murder of his wife. A whole boatload of his Scottish Rite brethren came down from Columbus, had him committed in the local insane asylum to protect him from charges. So involuntarily, and had him declared insane and committed until they could kind of figure out whether or not he actually killed his wife or not. And then once it was determined that he hadn't killed his wife, then they figured out a way to let him out. And he lived the rest of his life in relative peace. And, he was a pillar of the community. But again, like, get into the history of your Grand Lodge, because it's just weird and wonderful, the stuff you find.
There's always some good stuff in there for sure.
Yes.
Well, my brother, we are at the top of the hour.
Yeah.
And as we always end these off with a toast, I want to ask if you'd be kind enough once again to offer us a toast this evening.
You keep doing this, and I never think of anything until, yeah. I think I would offer a toast to those traditions that define us as a fraternity, define us as a jurisdiction, that create those meaningful connections and those bonds that would, have my brethren have me committed should my wife die, in a mysterious fashion. But I think I'll offer a toast to our ritual and traditions. Long may they live, long may they reign, and long may they make us who we are. So, cheers.
Here. Cheers.
And I will say to you, my good friend, should your wife ever die mysteriously, I will gladly have you committed and for your own protection. I love you so much. I will gladly do that for you.
I love you too, brother. I appreciate that.
Oh my gosh, she's gonna kill me.
I was gonna say we're gonna have to edit that part out for security purposes, but damn it, this is live. It's all right. She's not watching.
My wife just walked in the door, so
That's awesome.
she and Eliza just get back from their play. So,
well, before we
anyway.
hop off here, I do want to emphasize one of the last thoughts with you encouraging everyone to dive into that history. And we've said it on the show a million times, but we can't say it enough, because honestly, the history in each of our lodges, in 99% of the cases, we are that last generation that has the ability to get in there and do something with it to preserve it for future generations. Please go check it out, because I guarantee you, most of you will go check out your minutes and you'll see that they are not the best condition. I've seen it firsthand. They're disintegrating before us. The ink is disappearing from the papers. You don't know when that tornado is going to hit, when that fire is going to strike, when that water damage, book mites eating the books before you. We are that last generation. Please dive in there, find those stories. There is some amazing history, and preserve it. Digitize it, preserve it, read it, share it. And that's the number one thing. When you learn this history, share it with your brothers.
Midwest Conference, we had Dr. Heather Calloway from the Indiana University Center for Fraternal Research come in. She did a phenomenal presentation on just that. She echoed so many of those things that you just said. And yeah, so sorry, but yeah.
Good. That's fantastic. Well, brother, thank you so much for joining us again. We will definitely get you back for a part 3 and keep hearing about the amazing history of Ohio. Until next time, brothers, keep preserving the history of Freemasonry. We'll see you later. Have a good night.